The ballroom of Oldenvale Manor had never been quieter than the moment Duke Caspian Wren opened his mouth and shattered everything. 300 candles burned in the crystal chandeliers above. 300 guests stood in their finest silks and tailored coats, crystal flutes raised, waiting for the annual anniversary toast, the toast that Duchess Isolde Wren had planned for 6 weeks, down to the gold-pressed menus and the quartet from Vienna. She stood at the top of the marble staircase in a gown the color of midnight, pearl earrings catching the light, her dark hair pinned with a diamond clip that had once belonged to Caspian's grandmother. She was 27 years old, and she looked like everything a duchess was supposed to be. She looked, too, like a woman who had no idea that the floor was about to disappear beneath her feet. Caspian Wren stood at the center of the room, not beside her, not where he was supposed to be, tall and sharp-jawed in his black evening coat, a glass of champagne resting loosely in his hand. He had been charming all evening. Too charming, Isolde thought now, looking down at him, a small unease rising in her chest. He had smiled at everyone. He had laughed with Lord Ashwick. He had touched the elbow of Lady Fenwick just a half-second too long. Isolde had pressed the feeling down. She had been pressing feelings down for 2 years. It was a skill she had developed the way one develops a callus, slowly, through repeated pain, until the skin stops feeling. She looked at her husband across the candlelight and told herself it was just nerves. Just nerves. Then he tapped his glass. The sound rang out, a clear, crystalline note that silenced the quartet, the conversation, the clatter of serving spoons. Every face turned toward the Duke. He smiled. It was the smile Isolde had once loved desperately, the one that started slowly in the corner of his mouth before it reached his eyes. But tonight, she noticed with a cold slip of horror, it never reached his eyes at all. "I want to thank you all for being here," he said, and his voice carried the easy authority of a man who had never once doubted he deserved to be heard. "Oldenvale has seen many celebrations, but tonight's is different." He paused. The room waited. Isolde felt her fingers go cold around the railing. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. "I have an announcement," Caspian said, and his gaze swept the room with deliberate ease, landing briefly on a woman near the south window, Lady Vivian Ashdale in ivory silk, her auburn hair loose at her shoulders, her expression carefully blank in a way that only people who have been practicing blankness can manage. Isolde saw it. Saw the look. Saw the way Vivian's lips pressed together in what might have been restraint, might have been the effort of not smiling. The cold in Isolde's fingers spread up her arms. "As of this evening," Caspian continued, his voice smooth as polished marble, "I am announcing my intention to file for divorce. I am, as of tonight, a single man." 300 people stopped breathing, and Isolde Wren, Duchess, wife, woman, stood at the top of the staircase in her midnight gown with the world watching, and she felt the ground open up beneath her. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then came the sound, a low, terrible ripple of whispers, the particular sound of a room full of people trying to absorb something shocking while simultaneously choosing their words. Isolde heard it the way a person hears things underwater, muffled, distorted, wrong. She was aware of herself very clearly in that moment, her hand on the railing, the press of her heels against the marble step, the way her breath had gone shallow. She was aware, too, of every eye in that room lifting toward her. 300 pairs of eyes, some horrified, some fascinated. Lady Fenwick pressing her lips together behind her fan. Lord Ashwick's eyebrows raised nearly into his hairline, and Vivian Ashdale, Vivian, who had smiled at Caspian's dinner table 6 times in the last year, who had called Isolde her dearest friend, standing very still near the south window with her champagne untouched, not looking at Isolde at all. Isolde did not cry. She had never cried in public, not once in the 2 years she had been the Duchess of Oldenvale. She had cried in private, into pillows, into bath water, once very quietly in the back of a carriage on the way home from a dinner where she had watched Caspian whisper something into Vivian's ear while the footman cleared the soup. But she did not cry now. Something else happened instead. Something she would not understand until later. Not until she was alone in her room, in the dark, with the diamonds unclipped from her hair and the midnight gown in a heap on the floor. What happened was this. Beneath the horror, beneath the humiliation, beneath the shattering public shame of it, something inside Isolde Wren went very, very still. And in that stillness, something new began to breathe. She descended the staircase. 1 step, then the next, then the next. Every person in that room watched her do it. She did not hurry. She did not hold her breath or grip the railing or let her eyes fill with the tears that were pressing against the back of her throat. She walked down the full length of that staircase in her midnight gown, diamonds gleaming, head level, chin lifted, and when she reached the bottom, she did not look at Caspian. She did not look at Vivienne. She turned to the nearest footman, a young man of perhaps 18 with startled eyes, and she said very quietly, "Please have my carriage brought round." Then she walked toward the door, and behind her, in the enormous candlelit silence of Oldenvale's grandest ballroom, someone began to clap. 3 years before that night, Isolde Pemberton had been a woman with ink on her fingers and maps on her walls. She was not the kind of woman anyone at Oldenvale expected to become a duchess. She'd grown up in the north, in the grey stone city of Veldmere, in a household that smelled of old paper and coal smoke, where her father, a historian of considerable reputation and modest income, had raised her on the belief that a woman's mind was her most valuable possession. Isolde had taken this seriously. At 22, she could read 4 languages, argue constitutional law, and calculate land revenue with the focus of a barrister. She was not beautiful in the way that the daughters of earls and merchant princes were beautiful. She was something sharper than that. High cheekbones, serious eyes the color of winter rain, a stillness about her that people sometimes mistook for coldness until she laughed and the room shifted. She had met Caspian Wren at a charity auction in the autumn, the kind of event that required attendance but not necessarily presence, and she had been doing something he found immediately unforgivable. She had been reading during the speeches. Not quietly reading, not hiding it, but sitting with a book flat on the table beside her champagne flute, one finger holding her place, turning pages with the unhurried ease of someone who has made a private calculation that the speeches are not worth their time. He had sat down beside her. "That's extraordinarily rude," he had said. And she had looked up and said, without missing a beat, "So is wasting an educated woman's evening with commentary she already knows." He had stared at her for a moment, and then he had laughed. It was, she would think later, much later, in the ruins of what came after, the laugh of a man recognizing something unfamiliar. What followed was 6 months of a courtship that felt to Isolde like the most fully alive she had ever been. Caspian was not easy to know. He was private where others were performative, sharp where others were smooth. He asked questions that mattered, not what do you think of the weather or have you read the latest novel, but what do you believe and what do you fear, and if you could build one thing that would last beyond you, what would it be? Isolde answered every question honestly, because honesty was her nature, and he seemed to value that rarity the way a man who has eaten nothing but sweetness for years might value something clean and real. He brought her books. He argued with her ideas, genuinely argued, not the drawing room performance of disagreement, but the real thing, where both parties changed a little at the end. She fell in love with his mind before she fell in love with him. The proposal had been simple. No ballroom, no audience, no theatre. He had taken her walking along the cliffs above the Veldmere coast one October evening, grey sky above them, salt air cold against their faces, and he had stopped and looked at the sea for a long time without saying anything. Then he had said, "I am not a simple man to love. I'm aware of that. But I believe you are not a simple woman to love either, and I think that might be the only matching that makes sense for either of us." She had looked at him, at the line of his profile against the grey water, and felt something settle in her chest like a key finding its lock. She had said yes. She had said it quietly and with her whole self. The wedding had been grand because weddings of dukes were always grand. 400 guests in the chapel at Oldenvale, white roses stacked to the ceiling, the choir from the cathedral of St. Marin, singing something so achingly beautiful that her father had cried in the second pew, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief she had pressed for him that morning. Isolde had stood at the altar in ivory silk and thought, with a clarity she would later find heartbreaking, "I am beginning the best part of my life." She had believed it completely. She had walked into marriage with her eyes open and her heart unguarded, because that was what trust required. And Caspian had stood opposite her in the candlelight of that chapel and made his promises in a voice that did not shake. The first year was good. Not perfect. No marriage was perfect, but good, the way a fire is good in winter. Warm, necessary, occasionally unpredictable. She managed the estates, he managed Parliament. They disagreed about things that mattered, they agreed about things that mattered more. and at night he reached for her in the dark with a sincerity she had never doubted. She thought, on the morning of their first anniversary, standing on the balcony above the south garden with her coffee going cold in her hands and the first light of October touching the elm trees, "This is real. This is mine." She was grateful in the deep, quiet way that only people who have wanted something and received it can be grateful. It had not occurred to her yet to be afraid. Vivian Ashdale arrived in their lives in the second year. She arrived the way beautiful, clever women sometimes arrive, sideways through the door of ordinary social obligation, trailing something that felt at first like simple friendship. She was Lord Ashdale's youngest daughter, newly returned from a season abroad, with the kind of easy grace that filled rooms without seeming to try. Caspian had known her before. They had all known each other, in that particular way of English aristocracy, where everyone's histories overlapped and tangled. "Old friends," Caspian had said, introducing them at a dinner party in late January. Vivian had smiled at Isolde with warm, direct eyes and said, "I have heard such remarkable things about you." Isolde had smiled back. She had felt no alarm at all, and that, she would think later, that absence of alarm was the beginning of the end. The changes were small at first. That was the thing about betrayal. When it came slowly, it wrapped itself in enough ordinary fabric that it was hard to see the shape of it until it was already everywhere. Caspian began working later. He began traveling more, to London, to Edinburgh, once to Paris for a week regarding a parliamentary matter that Isolde, when she looked into it later, turned out to have resolved itself without requiring his presence. He was not cold to her. That would have been easier. Coldness she could have named. What he was instead was distracted, present in the room, but absent from the room in a way that she could feel but not prove. The way you can feel a door is slightly open in winter, even when you cannot see the crack. She told herself it was Parliament. She told herself it was the pressure of the estate negotiations. She told herself many things in the blue hours of early morning when she lay awake and the ceiling above her offered no answers. She noticed Vivian the way you notice a stone in your shoe. Not at first, then suddenly, with a sharpness that makes you wonder how you walked so far without acknowledging it. Vivian was everywhere that second year. At the Harlow dinner, laughing at something Caspian said when Isolde was across the room. At the Whitmore garden party, finding her way to the Duke's side of the lawn with the ease of a woman navigating familiar water. At the Aldenvale shooting weekend in October, when Isolde had organized everything, the menus, the rooms, the arrangements, and Vivian had arrived in a red coat that Isolde noted with a small, private feeling she did not name. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing you could point to and say, "Look, there it is, just a pattern, just a presence, just the particular shape a thing takes when it is trying very hard to look like nothing." Isolde was not naive. She had been raised by a historian father who taught her to read evidence, to look for patterns, to follow threads until they showed their full design. She read people the way she read documents, attending to what was absent as much as what was present, noting where the record went silent and asking why. She had been reading the evidence in her marriage for months, and the evidence was not good. But she also understood something about herself. She needed to be certain. She would not act on fear. She would not accuse without proof. She would not become a woman destroyed by jealousy and suspicion when jealousy and suspicion might be wrong. So she watched. She waited. She pressed down the rising cold in her chest every morning with the disciplined determination of a woman who has decided that dignity is not negotiable. The first real wound came at the Beaumont Christmas dinner in the middle of December, when the table was spread with silver and holly, and the fire was high and everyone was softened by wine and good food. Caspian had been seated 3 chairs from her. The seating was formal, arranged by Lady Beaumont, and Vivian was beside him. Isolde had watched, across the glittering distance of that long table, as Vivian leaned close to say something in Caspian's ear, watched him turn toward her, watched his face do something she had last seen it do in the early months of their courtship, when she had said something that surprised him, and he had looked at her with that particular expression, open, unguarded, young in a way he was not usually young. He looked like that now, looking at Vivian, not at his wife. Isolde had reached for her wine glass and found her hand was steady. She noted that with a distant kind of pride, the steady hand, the composed face, the way her conversation with Lord Beaumont on her left continued without interruption. She heard herself speaking. She heard her own voice discussing the new drainage proposals for the eastern counties with the kind of articulate fluency that her father's training had made automatic, even when her entire nervous system was doing something it had no name for. It was not rage, it was not grief, not yet. It was something colder and quieter, a recognition, the way recognition always felt when the thing you had suspected was finally standing plainly in front of you. She had suspected. Now she knew. She reached for the wine and drank it very calmly. She said nothing to Caspian that night. Not on the carriage home, not when they reached Aldenvale, not in the long silence that stretched between them in the hall, while a footman took their coats, and she said good night and meant it in all the ways she did not say aloud. She went to her room. She sat at her writing desk with her gloves still on, and the diamond earrings still in, and the holly still in her hair, and she sat there in the dark of her own stillness for a very long time. Then she opened the drawer of her desk and took out a fresh sheet of paper and a pen, and she wrote 2 names at the top of the page. Caspian, Vivienne. And beneath the names, she began to write everything she had seen, and the date she had seen it, and exactly what she knew. She was not building a case for anger, she was building a case for truth. There was a difference. She knew the difference the way she knew the difference between grieving and drowning. She would grieve later, when she was sure. For now she was a woman taking notes in the dark, her handwriting steady and clear, her father's daughter, her own person already, though she could not know it yet, beginning the long, slow work of becoming someone her humiliation would not define. She filled 3 pages. Then she folded them, sealed them in an envelope, and locked it in the bottom drawer with the spare key around her neck. She went to bed at 2 in the morning. She slept for 6 hours. She rose at 8, dressed without a maid's help, and went down to breakfast and said good morning to her husband with a face that gave nothing away. February. The month of frost that would not break. Aldenvale wrapped in a white silence that had lost its beauty and become something heavier, the silence of a house where 2 people share rooms and meals and obligations and nothing else. The silence that exists between people who no longer speak the same language, though they are using all the same words. Caspian was careful with her. That was the word. Careful. He was careful the way people are careful around something fragile, which told her everything, because she was not fragile. She had never been fragile. The carefulness told her that he knew what he was doing, and knowing had chosen to do it anyway, and chose now to manage its consequences rather than face them. She found that knowledge more crushing than anything else. It was not ignorance. It was choice. She had one conversation with him in those winter months that she would carry with her always, not because it was dramatic, not because anything was confessed or resolved, but because of what she saw in his face in the silence between his words. She had been working in the estate office reviewing the February accounts when he came in and sat down across from her and said he thought they should talk. She had put down her pen. She had looked at him across the desk with the same winter-grey eyes that had looked at him over the cliff edge in October 3 years ago, and said simply, "Then talk." He had been quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, the frost pressed against the window panes. He said, "I don't know how we got here." And she had looked at him, at this man she had loved completely, this man who had asked her what she feared and what she believed, and who had stood in that chapel and made his promises. And she had said very quietly, "I do." She did not accuse. She did not weep. She did not throw the inkwell or turn over the desk or make any of the scenes that the situation surely warranted. She said "I do," and she held his gaze and let him understand without elaboration what she meant. She had been watching. She had been noting. She knew. The color left his face. He looked, and this was the thing that would stay with her longest. He looked relieved. Not guilty, not desperate, not even ashamed in the way she might have expected. He looked like a man whose secret had been too heavy to carry and who had, finally, been allowed to set it down. And that relief, that particular release in his expression, told her something about the nature of their marriage she had not fully known until that moment. He had not been protecting her. He had been protecting himself. He had always been protecting himself. She asked one question. She said, "Does she know?" He did not ask who. He said very quietly, "Yes." And that was the second death. Not the infidelity itself, not even the betrayal, but the knowledge that it had been mutual and deliberate and ongoing, that Vivienne Ashdale had sat at her table and eaten her food and called her dearest friend while knowing exactly what she was doing, while choosing it, while wearing that particular polished blankness that Isolde had mistaken for reserve and was now correctly reading as the face of a woman managing her own conscience. 2 people. both of them choosing, both of them looking at Isolde and choosing anyway. She thought about the red coat at the shooting weekend. She thought about the Christmas dinner and the open, unguarded look on her husband's face. She said nothing more. What she felt was not what she had expected. In her imagination of this moment, and she had imagined it in the small dark hours when pretending was exhausting, she had expected rage. A clean, hot, purifying rage that would burn everything into ash and leave her standing in the ruins with something like resolution. What she felt instead was a cold grief that went all the way down, the kind of grief that does not announce itself with tears, but settles into the bones and the body like water into stone. She was grieving the specific version of her life she had believed in, the version where he had meant it, the version where the cliff at Veldmere and the chapel and the questions about what she feared had been real and lasting. She was grieving the man she had thought she married, who might have existed, who might have been real once, briefly, before something in him had decided that what she offered was less important than what he wanted. She rose from her desk that evening, and she stood at the window and she looked at the frost-white grounds of Oldenvale in the last grey light of a February afternoon, and she let herself feel it, all of it. The grief and the humiliation and the particular loneliness of a woman who has been careful and kind and genuine and has been repaid with lies. She let it move through her like a tide, and she did not try to stop it or manage it or press it down. She had been pressing things down for 2 years, and she was done with that. She would feel this fully, and she would not diminish it, because she had done nothing that required diminishing. She had been a good wife. She had been honest and steady and real. The failure did not belong to her. And then, slowly, with the particular effort of a woman deciding who she intends to be in the aftermath of what has broken her, she straightened. She turned from the window. She walked back to the desk and she sat down and she opened the estate accounts and she went back to work. Because the work was hers, and the work was real, and no one could take the work. The frost stayed on the windows. The fire crackled. Outside, Aldenvale stood silent in the winter evening, waiting, as it had always waited, for whoever would take the trouble to keep it. There was a woman in the village of Aldenvale, 63 years old, iron-haired, with hands scarred from decades of estate work, whose name was Mrs. Seraphina Column, and she had managed the Wren household accounts before Isolde had arrived, and she had managed them badly, not from dishonesty, but from exhaustion. She was the first person Isolde had reformed when she became Duchess, sitting down with Seraphina in the kitchen on a cold January morning 18 months ago, and going through every column of the books with the calm precision of a woman who enjoys finding errors, not to condemn, but to correct. Seraphina had watched her work in silence for 2 hours, then said, "You are not what I expected, Your Grace." Isolde had said, "No one ever is." They had understood each other from that moment. It was Seraphina she called to the estate office on a grey March morning, 3 weeks after the February conversation with Caspian. "I need to know everything," Isolde said, and Seraphina, who had been keeping house in Oldenvale for 30 years and who knew every room and every drawer and every guest who had ever walked those corridors, looked at her Duchess with the steady, sorrowful eyes of a woman who had been waiting to be asked. She told her everything. She told her about the letters delivered to the East Study that were not among the official correspondence, about the telephone calls from London that came when Isolde was visiting her father, about the particular Friday in October when Caspian had told his wife he was in Edinburgh and Seraphina had seen his carriage return at midnight from the direction of the Ashdale estate, 12 miles south. Every detail was delivered without embellishment, without judgment, in the flat, clear voice of a woman reporting facts, and Isolde received each one the same way, writing it down with her pen, moving steadily across the page and her face giving nothing away. She was not building rage, she was building architecture. There was a structure to what she was creating, a careful, deliberate arrangement of facts that would support something she had decided she needed. Not revenge in the explosive, theatrical sense, but accountability. She had been a duchess for 2 years. She had managed the Wren estates with a competence that Caspian's own solicitor, Mr. Aldrich Fenn, had described in a meeting the previous autumn as exceptional, Your Grace. Frankly, the best estate management we have seen in a generation. She had turned the Eastern Properties drainage deficit into a surplus. She had resolved the tenant disputes that had been festering since the 1880s. She had done all of this quietly, without applause, in the background of her husband's public life, and she intended to ensure that when the time came, the record would be clear. She wrote to her father. Not about the marriage. She could not bear to write about the marriage, not yet, but about a question of law. Her father, Professor Oberon Pemberton, 60 years old, still sharp as a tack, replied within the week with 11 pages of dense, precise notes on property law, inheritance law, and the legal protections available to a woman of title in the event of a dissolved marriage. He had not asked why she needed to know. He had assumed why, with the quiet accuracy of a man who loved his daughter and had watched her husband at the wedding with the eyes of a historian trained to see the shape of things. Isolde read all 11 pages. She read them twice. She made notes in the margins, and she folded the letter into the same locked drawer with the sealed envelope from December. She also wrote to her father's old student, a woman named Theodora Mast, who had trained as a solicitor in the firm of Bellworthy and Crane in London, a firm that had represented the interests of several women in high-profile dissolution cases and had a reputation for being extremely thorough. Theodora replied by return post, using language that was formal and measured, and between whose lines lay a very clear message. Come when you are ready, and come with everything you have. Isolde had smiled at that letter in a way she had not smiled in months. The smile of a woman assembling resources. The smile of a woman who has decided that when the blow falls, she will be the one deciding where it lands. She continued her duties. She attended every social engagement. She sat beside Caspian at dinners and smiled at appropriate moments and answered questions about the East, a state's drainage system with the kind of specific, data-fluent authority that made the men at the table look slightly startled. She organized the spring charity auction for the Aldenvale Hospital Fund and raised 12% more than the previous year. She was a duchess, fully and precisely, in every public moment, because the public moments were not about him. They were about the people who depended on the work she did, the tenants and the staff and the hospital and the village, and none of them deserved to be casualties of her private war. She allowed herself one indulgence. On a Sunday afternoon in late April, she asked for her horse, Sable, a grey mare she had brought from Veldmere, and she rode alone across the south fields of Aldenvale, through the long gold afternoon, past the elm woods and the river, and the old mill that she had arranged to have repaired in January, until she reached the highest point of the estate, a ridge from which you could see the full breadth of what the Wrens had built and what she had protected and improved in 2 years of careful work. She sat on the ridge for a long time, with the wind in her hair and the sunset turning the fields below her every shade of amber and rose. She was thinking about the future. She was thinking about it clearly, without fear, for the first time. The future would be hard. The future would require more of her than she had yet given. She was equal to it. She had always been equal to it. She asked to meet Vivian Ashdale alone. She did not ask Caspian. She wrote directly to Vivian on a Tuesday morning in May, with a note that was precise and without warmth, and said only, "I would be grateful for an hour of your time at Aldenvale on Thursday. Come alone." She did not explain. She did not need to explain. The fact that Vivian came, arriving at 2 o'clock in a carriage that was perhaps too well appointed for an ordinary afternoon call, in a dress that was perhaps more carefully chosen than the occasion required, told Isolde everything she needed to know about the state of Vivian's conscience. She met her in the morning room. Not the drawing room. The drawing room was ceremonial. The morning room was where Isolde actually worked and lived, and she had chosen it deliberately because she wanted Vivian to understand that she was entering Isolde's space, not performing in a shared stage. Vivian was beautiful. Isolde noticed this with the detached clarity she brought to all observation, noted it the way she would note the height of a wall or the depth of a river, as a fact relevant to the terrain. She was 25, amber-haired, with the easy self-possession of a woman who had been admired all her life and had built her sense of self on the admiration. She sat down across from Isolde and folded her hands in her lap and met her gaze and did not look away, which Isolde noted as either courage or performance, or perhaps both. "You know why you're here," Isolde said. It was not a question. Vivian's chin tilted. "I thought I might." "Then let's not spend time pretending otherwise," Isolde said. "I know what has happened. I know the duration of it. I know the specific occasions. I'm not here to grieve at you." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are you here to do?" It was the question of a woman who had come expecting attack and found instead something she couldn't categorize, and the uncertainty was visible in the slight tension around her mouth, the way her carefully folded hands pressed just a fraction tighter together. Isolde studied her. She was trying to understand something, not to forgive it, not yet, perhaps not ever, but to understand it, because understanding was how she moved through the world, and she could not move forward without comprehending the full shape of what had happened. "I want to understand," Isolde said. "I want to know whether you thought about me." A long silence. Vivienne looked at the window, then back. "Yes," she said. And the honesty of it, quiet and without justification, landed in Isolde's chest like something that hurt differently than she had expected. They sat together for an hour. It was not forgiveness. Isolde was not there to offer forgiveness and did not pretend otherwise. It was something more complicated than that. It was two women in the wreckage of a thing that one had built and one had helped to destroy, trying to see the other clearly. Vivienne was not a monster. Isolde had not needed to meet her to know that. Monsters were simple, and nothing about this situation was simple. She was a woman who had wanted what someone else had, and who had told herself stories about why it was acceptable that only fell apart under the light of this particular morning, this particular room, this particular face across the table that would not look away. Isolde watched Vivienne understand this about herself in real time. It was not a comfortable thing to witness. It was not meant to be comfortable. At the end of the hour, Vivienne said, "I'm sorry." Her voice was low and she was not performing it. Isolde looked at her for a long time. "I know you are," she said, "but that doesn't change what was done." She stood. The meeting was over. Vivienne rose too, and at the door she paused and said, "He told me," and Isolde said quietly and with absolute finality, "I don't need to know what he told you." Because she didn't. Because whatever Caspian had told Vivienne about his marriage, about Isolde, about the shape of what existed between them, it was the story a man tells to justify what he has already decided to do, and she would not measure herself against it. She showed Vivienne to the door. She watched the carriage leave. She went back to her desk. She sat at her desk for a long time after the carriage disappeared down the Oldenvale Drive. She was thinking about the word sorry, what it weighed, what it cost, what it was worth in the economy of actual damage. She had been sorry many times herself. She had been sorry for her own failures of attention, her own moments of coldness, the evenings she had chosen the estate accounts over the conversation Caspian had needed. She had been sorry the way honest people are sorry, with the full weight of the knowledge that sorry does not undo the thing, only acknowledges it. She thought, "I have my own accounting to do." And then she thought, "Not today. Today I have done enough." She picked up a pen. She returned to the estate accounts. Outside the morning room windows, the May afternoon was green and gold, the elm trees full, the south garden in bloom, white roses and lavender, and the small herb beds she had planted in her first spring at Oldenvale, because she had wanted something of her own that grew. The roses were opening. The lavender was thick and blue-purple in the light. She had planted those. She had tended them. They were, in their small and wordless way, entirely hers. She found that she was crying, not in the way she had cried into pillows in the small hours, not the compressed private grief of a woman trying not to be seen, but openly, silently, with her pen still in her hand and the accounts still open in front of her, crying the way a person does when they have finally permitted themselves to grieve what they have lost and are surprised to discover that grief, allowed its full space, is also a kind of release. Theodora Mast arrived at Oldenvale on a Thursday in June, in a grey travelling coat and with 2 heavy document bags and the particular energy of a woman who does excellent work and knows it. She was 38, compact, quick-eyed, with short dark hair and the kind of handshake that left no ambiguity about what kind of person you were dealing with. Caspian was in London. Isolde had arranged the timing of this visit with the care she'd been bringing to everything since February, quietly, thoroughly, leaving nothing to chance. She led Theodora to the estate office, her room, her desk, her domain, and she spread everything across the table. The accounts, the estate records, the documentation of her 2 years of management, the notes Serafina had provided, the letters from her father, the sealed envelope from December, and a summary document she had prepared herself with the methodical clarity that she knew was her greatest professional gift. Theodora read everything in 2 hours without comment, occasionally making a small notation in the margin of her own notebook. Isolde worked at the other end of the desk, because the work did not stop for personal crisis. It never stopped, and let the silence be productive rather than anxious. When Theodora finished, she set down her pen and looked at Isolde over the documents with an expression that was professional but also, Beneath the professionalism, something warmer. "This," she said, gesturing at the records, "is extraordinary." She meant the estate management documentation. She meant the systematic way in which Isolde had recorded, organized, and preserved 2 years of evidence of her contribution to the Wren estate. She meant the 23% improvement in estate revenue. She meant the resolved tenant disputes and the repaired properties and the documented, witnessed record of a woman who had done far more than her title required. "When did you begin preparing this?" Theodora asked. Isolde considered the question. "Honestly," she said, "from the beginning." Theodora looked at her steadily. "You suspected from the beginning?" Isolde shook her head slowly. "I didn't suspect anything, I just—" She paused, finding the right words. "I was taught that records matter, that the work you do should be documented because documentation is dignity. My father taught me that. If you do good work and there is no record of it, the world assumes you did nothing." Theodora nodded slowly, and something in her expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. The look of a woman who has fought similar battles and understands the armor that experience builds. "In that case," she said, "you have everything you need." They spent 2 days at the table together, going through the documentation, identifying what would be relevant, constructing a clear picture of what Isolde had contributed and what the marriage settlement had originally provided, and what the dissolution, which was now an inevitability, both of them named without drama, would mean in practice. Isolde was not asking for more than what was fair. She was asking for exactly what was fair, and she was asking for it with the full support of 2 years of documented evidence and the most competent solicitor she could find. She was also asking for the East Estate, the property that had been her project, the land she had drained and repaired and returned to profitability, the physical embodiment of her work. That was the one non-negotiable thing, the thing she had decided on that April evening on the ridge above the South Fields. On the second evening, Theodora stayed for dinner. They ate in the small dining room, just the two of them, with a fire and a bottle of the estate's own wine, and the conversation shifted, because conversations always shift when the work is done and two women who respect each other are sitting with good wine, from documents to something more personal. Theodora said carefully, "How are you?" And Isolde felt the question land in her chest the way simple, genuine questions do when you have been operating in performance mode for months. She thought about the honest answer. Then she said, "I am sad. I am also, I think, for the first time in a long time, exactly myself." Theodora nodded. She did not say it will get better. Isolde would have found that patronizing. She said, "That's the most important part. The rest follows." After Theodora left on Saturday morning, Isolde walked through every room of Oldenvale alone, not as an inventory, not for any practical purpose, but as a kind of private ceremony of acknowledgement. She walked through the grand rooms with their high ceilings and ancestral portraits and the weight of the Wren family history pressing down from every wall. She walked through the estate office where she'd spent 2 years of mornings. She walked through the kitchens and the servants' hall and the east wing, and she walked through the garden in the cool of the early evening, past the white roses and the lavender she had planted. She was saying goodbye. Not to Oldenvale, she was not leaving yet, and one property was not leaving at all, but to the version of herself who had arrived here believing completely, who had given everything without reservation, who had loved with her whole self and found it was not enough. She grieved that woman. She grieved her the way you grieve a good friend who is not dead, but who is also no longer who they were, with tenderness and sorrow and a specific kind of love that does not require the person to still exist in order to be honored. Then she walked back into the house. She had a meeting with the estate carpenter in the morning about repairs to the mill roof. She had notes to write, accounts to review, a letter to send to London. She went to her desk. She worked until midnight. And somewhere in the middle of it, somewhere between the mill roof figures and the letter to the county surveyor, she noticed with a quiet kind of surprise that she felt something unfamiliar. It took her a moment to identify it. Then she recognized it. It was something very close to free. The summer anniversary ball was Isolde's idea. That was the fact that would haunt her later, that she had organized the night that destroyed her. She had organized it because she was a Duchess, and this was what Duchesses did, because the annual event had been on the calendar since January, because the hospital fund depended on the donations it generated, and because she had decided long ago that her personal suffering would not be permitted to damage the work that other people depended on. She had spent 6 weeks on the preparations, the Vienna Quartet, the pressed gold menus, the midnight gown. She had done all of it knowing, because by June she knew everything, and Theodora's paperwork was already drafted and waiting in a drawer in London, that this would be the last event she organized as Duchess of Oldenvale. She had decided to make it the best one. On the afternoon of the ball, she stood in front of her dressing mirror while her maid, a young woman named Petra, pinned up her hair, and she looked at herself for a long time. Not with vanity, she had never been vain, but with the specific attention of a woman taking stock. She was 27. She was the daughter of a historian and the granddaughter of a schoolteacher and a person of considerable intelligence and documented competence, and she was standing at the edge of the most painful night of her life, and she was going to walk through it with her head up. The diamonds, Caspian's grandmother's diamonds, she chose deliberately, though she would remove them when the night was over. They were beautiful, and they were real, and they had been given in good faith by a woman who deserved to have them worn with dignity. She put them on. She came down the stairs at 7 o'clock and saw the ballroom full of light, and she felt something for a moment, a brief, involuntary pang of pride, because she had made that room beautiful, because every detail of that beauty was her work, because she was good at this, and she knew she was good at this. Then she saw Caspian standing in the center of the room, and beside him, not beside him in the way a husband stands with his wife, but beside him in the way that Isolde now recognized with the clarity of a woman who had been watching for a year, stood Vivienne. Vivienne in ivory silk. Vivienne, who had sat across the morning-room table from Isolde in May and said, "I am sorry." Vivienne, who had come back anyway, or who had never fully left, or who was here tonight because Caspian had invited her, which meant that whatever Theodora's documents said, the thing itself had not ended. She could have said nothing. That was the option she had prepared herself for, to get through the evening with composure, to allow the announcement to happen in whatever form it came, to be the dignified woman in the midnight gown who descended the staircase without flinching. She had rehearsed it in her head 100 times. What she had not rehearsed was the specific sight of Vivienne in ivory beside Caspian in the candlelight of the room she had decorated on the night she had organized, eating the food she had chosen in the house she had managed, before they came to announce that this was no longer her house at all. She had not rehearsed the specific, precise fury of that. She had been so focused on building her architecture, on being steady and documented and strategically prepared, that she had forgotten to account for the raw human fact of the thing. The wound was not a metaphor. It was a wound. And it opened. She stood at the top of the staircase and she breathed. She breathed the way Theodora had taught her to breathe in the 2 days of their working session. Slowly, from the bottom, with the full deliberate weight of a woman choosing her next action. She was not going to weep. She was not going to erupt. She was not going to make the scene that every person in that room would remember and describe and diminish her with for years. She was going to be herself, exactly herself, the self she had identified on the evening after Theodora left, the free self, the one with her whole architecture behind her. She touched the diamonds at her ears. She descended the staircase. She was a duchess until the moment she chose not to be, and not a second earlier. When Caspian tapped his glass and the room went silent and she heard him begin, "I have an announcement," she did not close her eyes, did not reach for the railing, did not try to stop what was coming. She stood at the top of those stairs and she let it come. She let the words land. "As of this evening, I am announcing my intention to file for divorce. I am, as of tonight, a single man." She let the silence press, the whispers rise, the 300 faces turn toward her. She let herself be seen in the full exposure of it. The humiliated wife, the public disclosure, the very particular cruelty of being named in absentia while you are standing in the room. She felt the heat of 300 stares. She felt the specific chill of Vivian Ashdale's careful blankness from the south window. She stood in all of it, and she did not fall apart. And then something happened that she had not expected, that she had not planned for, that arrived from some part of herself that had nothing to do with architecture or documents or strategic preparation. Standing there, exposed, humiliated at the absolute worst moment of 2 years of a very difficult life, she felt it. The thing that had been growing in the still places of her since February, since the frost on the windows, since the morning room conversation with Vivienne, since the April evening on the ridge. She felt it rise through her the way warmth rises in a room when the fire's finally lit. Slow, then present, then undeniable. She descended the staircase. Someone clapped. And in the carriage, with the cold night pressing against the windows and Aldenvale receding behind her, Isolde Wren sat very still in her midnight gown, and felt, beneath the grief and the humiliation, beneath the sharp edge of the wound, the quiet, certain, deeply inconvenient sensation of having at last begun. 3 weeks after the ball, on a grey Tuesday morning, Theodora Mast walked into the offices of Bellworthy and Crane with 2 document bags and a focused, particular energy, and filed the papers that set everything in motion. She had been preparing them since June. She had cross-referenced them against every piece of evidence in Isolde's locked drawer. She had arranged the documentation of the estate accounts and the management records, and the full accounting of what Isolde had contributed to the Wren fortune over 2 years, in a form that was precise and irrefutable, and deeply inconvenient for anyone who preferred the simple narrative of an abandoned duchess with nothing to show for her trouble. Isolde was not at the filing. She was at the East Estate, her estate, the one she had made her condition, walking the drainage channels she had designed, in Wellington boots and a work coat, noting which sections needed attention before winter. Caspian's reaction came through his solicitors first, in the form of a letter to Theodora that was correct in its language and revealing in its assumptions. The assumptions were, in essence, that Isolde would want what discarded wives usually wanted: a quiet settlement, a comfortable allowance, a property somewhere not too visible, and the dignity of discretion. His solicitors had offered a generous allowance, a townhouse in Bath, and a request that the East Estate be excluded from negotiations as it was central to the Wren family's agricultural interests. Theodora read this letter to Isolde on a Wednesday evening, and Isolde sat very still through the reading, and then said, "Bath! Just the word!" And then she smiled. Not a bitter smile, not the smile of a woman pleased by her enemy's mistake, but the specific smile of a person who has been underestimated so comprehensively that the underestimation has become almost funny. "They do not know," Theodora said. It was a statement, not a question. "No," Isolde agreed. "They know that I manage the estates. They do not know what that management is worth, specifically and in documented financial terms." Theodora placed the counter-proposal on the table. Isolde had helped draft it. It was not aggressive in tone. It was calm, specific, evidenced, and entirely without sentiment. It acknowledged the breakdown of the marriage without assigning blame. It requested exactly what the evidence supported: a fair division of the assets that had appreciated during their marriage, weighted by documented contribution. It requested the East Estate on the grounds of the 23% revenue improvement that Isolde had produced and that the Wren family's own financial records supported. It did not threaten. It did not plead. It simply presented the facts and their logical implications. The response from Caspian's solicitors took 10 days. When it came, the change in tone was remarkable. Someone, Caspian himself, or a solicitor who had finally read the documentation carefully, had understood what they were looking at. The letter was more respectful. The language had shifted from assumption to negotiation. The bathhouse had been withdrawn from the proposal without comment. Theodora read Isolde the key paragraph over the telephone, and Isolde heard, in the silence between Theodora's words, the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has done exactly what she set out to do. "They want a meeting," Theodora said. "They want to discuss terms." Isolde said, "Thursday works." The meeting was in London, in Bellworthy and Crane's conference room, which had a tall window overlooking a square that was just coming into its autumn color. The first bronze touching the edges of the plane trees, the light going golden and slanted the way London light went in September. Caspian was there. She had not seen him since the ball. He was thinner. She noted that without satisfaction, simply as a fact. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping well, and something in that observation was both painful and clarifying, because she was not glad he was suffering, and she was not glad because she had been a woman who loved him, and some part of her, deep and stubborn, was still capable of wishing him better than this. She sat across the table from him, and she was very composed, and she held his gaze when he finally looked at her, and what she saw in his face was not quite contrition. It was something more complicated, the expression of a man confronting the specific cost of his specific choices. She said 2 things to him directly during that meeting. Everything else was handled by Theodora, correctly and without drama. But there were two moments when the solicitors fell silent and the room was only the two of them, and she said what needed to be said. The first was at the beginning, when he had looked at her and said quietly, "I'm sorry." She had looked back and said, "I know." Not forgiving it. Not today. Perhaps not ever fully, but receiving it honestly, because she had never been capable of anything other than honesty. The second was at the end, when the terms had been agreed and the papers were ready, and the room was gathering itself to release them all back into their separate futures. She said, looking at him directly, "I gave you everything I had." A pause. "You should know that, so you know what you chose to walk away from." He said nothing, but he looked, she thought, as though he would carry that sentence for a very long time. She walked out of Belworthy & Crane on a September afternoon into the gold-washed light of London, and she stood on the pavement for a moment with the traffic moving past and the plane trees rustling in the light autumn wind, and she did the thing she had been moving towards since February. She exhaled, a long, complete releasing breath, the kind that comes from somewhere deep in the chest, the kind that marks an ending and a beginning in the same movement of air. Theodora came out behind her and said, "East Estate is yours, full tenure, revenue rights intact." Isolde nodded. She had known it would be. She had built that case from the ground up, and she was the daughter of a historian who taught her that the work you document is the work that survives. She looked up at the London sky, grey and gold, the particular autumn colour of that city, and she thought, now what? And the answer came back quietly from somewhere in the region of her own chest, steady and clear, now everything. Winter came to the East Estate like a friend she had been expecting. Isolde had moved her things from Aldenvale in October. Not many things. She had arrived at Aldenvale with less than people expected, and she left with less than people expected, taking the objects that were genuinely hers, and leaving behind the objects that belonged to the house and the history and the role she was releasing. She took her father's books and her maps and her work journals and the tools of her trade. She took the diamonds, because they had been Caspian's grandmother's, and she returned them herself in person to the Dowager Duchess, who received them with an expression that Isolde could not read, and said nothing except after a long pause, "You were better than he deserved." Isolde had nodded. It was not a comfort, but it was an honesty, and honesty had always been what she required. She settled into the East Estate as she had settled into Aldenvale 2 years earlier, methodically, precisely, attending to every detail with the focused care of a person who understands that a home is made by the quality of attention you bring to it. The house was smaller than Aldenvale, Georgian, foursquare, stone grey in the winter light, with gardens that had been let go in the years before her work, and that were full of the specific beauty of things that are growing back without being asked to. She walked those gardens every morning in the first weeks of November, hands in her pockets, breath clouding in the cold air, noting what needed attention and what only needed time. There was a particular apple tree near the east wall, old and overgrown and still producing. She had stood under it one November morning and eaten an apple that had fallen in the night, cold and sharp and real, and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Appetite. Simple, clean, human appetite. Her father came at Christmas. He was 61 that year, a little slower on the stairs than she remembered, his white hair cut shorter than usual, and he arrived with 3 bags of books and his old coat, and the particular expression of a father who has watched his child walk through fire and has had the discipline not to intervene. They sat in the kitchen that first evening with tea and the remains of a roast chicken and the fire going, and he did not ask how she was until the second cup, and when he did, she said simply, "Good." He looked at her for a long moment, the long, unhurried look of a historian assessing evidence, and then he said, "Yes, I see that." He put his hand over hers on the table, briefly, warmly, without elaboration. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. News of the divorce had moved through society with the speed and thoroughness of things that society finds useful. There were narratives. The cool, capable Duchess who had been cast aside for the beautiful Vivian Ashdale, the dignified exit from the ball, the subsequent settlement which several people in legal circles described in careful language as unexpectedly favorable to Lady Isolde. There were people who were kind and people who were not. She was no longer a duchess, the title had dissolved with the marriage, and there were people who took satisfaction in her reduction to plain Miss Pemberton, as though a title had ever been the point. Isolde found she minded this considerably less than anyone expected. She was Miss Pemberton. She had been Miss Pemberton before she was anything else. She had been herself before she was a Duchess, and she was still herself now. The self was, as it turned out, the only part that had always been hers. She began writing in January. Not the estate accounts. She had those running smoothly by December, the drainage channels in order, the tenant meetings scheduled, the revenue projections exceeding the previous years by the same steady margin she had produced at Aldenvale. She began writing something else, the project her father had suggested for years, and she had always deferred, because there had been a husband and a role and the exhausting work of maintaining a life she was not allowed to fully inhabit. A study of estate management practice in the Victorian era with specific attention to the contribution of women who had managed properties that history recorded only in men's names. She had been thinking about it since Aldenvale. She had been living it for 2 years. She sat at the window of her study on a grey January morning with the East Estate spread out below her in its winter quiet, and she opened a new notebook and she wrote the first sentence, and then the second, and then she was writing. In March, she received a letter from a man she did not know. His name was Mr. Dorian Vesper, and he was an agricultural economist at the University of Colworth, and he had read a paper she had presented at the County Agricultural Society meeting in February, her first public presentation, delivered to a room of mostly skeptical male landowners in the flat, clear voice she had inherited from her father and refined through 2 years of managing rooms full of people who assumed they knew more than she did. The letter said that her analysis of drainage investment and long-term yield was among the most precisely evidenced arguments he had encountered, and would she be interested in presenting at the university's spring symposium on estate management reform. She had read the letter twice, then she had set it on her desk and sat with it for a few minutes, with the March light coming through the window and the apple tree beginning to show the first green suggestion of new leaves. She wrote back the same afternoon. Yes, she would speak at the symposium. She had things to say, things about documentation and evidence and the invisible labor of women who built and managed and preserved and were not credited, things about what estates look like from the inside of the work rather than the outside of the ownership. She had been building towards saying them for 2 years, perhaps her whole life. She sealed the letter and gave it to the post, and then she went to her desk and opened her notebook to the chapter she was working on, and she wrote until dinner. She wrote with the particular absorbed joy of a person doing work that belongs to them completely. She wrote with her father's books around her and her maps on the wall and her estate outside the window doing exactly what she had designed it to do. She was 27 years old. She had been humiliated publicly by a man who had not understood what he had. She had walked out of it. She had walked forward. She had made something real. And in her small grey study on an East Estate that was entirely her own, with the spring light coming through the window and the pen moving steadily across the page and the future open and unmapped before her, Isolde Pemberton, once the embarrassed Duchess, smiled. Please drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in, midday in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are.